Hello and welcome to the All Things ADHD podcast. I'm your host, Melvin Bogard. Today we're discussing how ADHD may increase the odds of being overweight and having obesity, dysregulated eating, barriers in the African American community that may prevent an individual from seeking treatment, and ways to live a healthier and better lifestyle. My guest is Dr. Roberto Olivardia. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
First, let's discuss the similarity and difference between overweight and having obesity. How are they similar and how are they different?
Sure. So what we're talking about is, a lot of these definitions, either by the Center for Disease Control or medical associations, is there's a formula known as the body mass index, which is basically an index looking at our weight and our height. And the actual formula it's defining a person's weight in kilograms divided by the square of their height in meters. Little math for people today. And if your BMI is 25 to 30, you would be considered overweight. If your body mass index is over 30, you would be considered obese. And that is basically sort of by those measures having a higher body fat percentage. So that's sort of the standard definition of what we refer to when we say the words overweight and obese from a clinical perspective.
How prevalent is having obesity in the U.S. and also in the ADHD population? And is having obesity increasing, especially for children?
Yes, so obesity is actually quite prevalent that even if we look at trends that worldwide obesity has nearly tripled since the mid-1970s. So this is something that not only is an issue, but is one that we're seeing an upward trend of. That according to the CDC, that 39 million children under the age of 5 are considered overweight or obese, according to 2020 data. Over 340 million children and adolescents ages 5 to 19 would fit in that category of overweight and obese. So it affects a large number of individuals, that even amongst adults, it could be upwards of 40% of people, which, on one hand, people would sort of question and think, well, gosh, is it, that much? But again, these are newer data and newer numbers that if we look 30, 40 years ago, was very different. So it's definitely something that is common and at the same time is an issue.
And so how does that sort of relate into the ADHD population?
So with ADHD, the people with ADHD definitely carry a much higher risk. And there's a number of studies that have looked at the prevalence of obesity in ADHD populations, the higher risk that people with ADHD have for and their predispositions for obesity. And there are lots of different factors, really, that when we understand, as we understand ADHD, it makes a lot of sense why people with ADHD would be a population at risk. I mean, there are these multidimensional factors, starting with just neurochemically. We know that the ADHD brain is basically in a dopamine deficit, and dopamine being a neurochemical that's implicated in reward. And so foods that tend to be less healthy, foods that are high in sugar, that are high in fat, high in simple carbs, which have more calorie, that are more calorie dense, also can stimulate levels of dopamine in the brain. We also know people with ADHD have dysregulations in GABA, which is another neurochemical that's implicated in inhibition. So if we have appropriate levels of GABA, we have a better pause button. And it turns out the ADHD brain has lower levels of GABA. So the part of people that might say, maybe I've eaten too much, I'll stop. ADHD individuals have a harder time with that. We know genetically there's gene mapping that's looking at mapping certain genes to ADHD, to all different type of issues. But there's one in particular known as the DRD4 gene that's been mapped for ADHD and also obesity. They find that that same gene is implicated in obesity. So you see this sort of interaction. We know that people with ADHD also have very poor executive functions, that to eat healthily, we have to plan our meals. We have to make sure we're shopping and getting to the supermarket before we run out of something. We need to start thinking about a meal hours before we cook it. We don't want to think about it at the time we want to be eating it, because then it's like, oh, this is too much work. Let me go, fast food. And that could be really overwhelming for people with ADHD. In addition, people with ADHD have poor interoceptive awareness. And what interoceptive awareness is basically the ability to be mindful to what's happening internally in the body. And that's true for sleep cues, for going to the bathroom, but that includes hunger. So, the anecdote I often share is from my own experience is that I remember as a child being at a birthday party, Chuck E. Cheese birthday party, and I love pizza, and my friend's mom said, "Oh, guys, eat the rest of this pizza. I don't want it to go to waste." And we had eaten plenty, and one of my friends were like, "Oh no, I'm good. I'm full." And I was like, "Oh, you didn't like the pizza?" And he said, "No, I liked it. I'm just full." And I thought, "Oh, you just didn't like this pizza?" And he's looking at me like, "What is your problem?" I'm not hungry. And I tell you, Melvin, in my head, I think back to that. I'm like, it did not even occur to me. Like, I like pizza. It's in front of me. Of course I'm going to eat it. Like, the idea that I would tune into my body to be like, oh no, I'm actually satisfied, was something I had to learn actually as an adult. And those are the things that are so important for clinicians, for people with ADHD to understand, because it could feel very shaming sometimes to people with ADHD when people are looking at them like, how are you eating so much in that way? People with ADHD also tend to eat while doing other things, which to anybody would lead to more dysregulated eating. Watching TV. I've had patients that are driving and eating meals, which is so dangerous. And then in addition, having ADHD, people can be in a hyper-focused zone, let's say, where they're working through something and might not eat for hours. And then once that activity is done, they are hit with this wall of hunger, which can lead to binge eating behaviors. And then all the emotional triggers that anyone could relate to, stress eating, people with ADHD are probably more prone to, because people with ADHD have a higher propensity for emotional dysregulation. It's harder for people with ADHD to self-soothe, to ground themselves. So I have patients who talk about when they're stressed, they eat. But with ADHD, it's also when they're bored, that a lot of times food is just this reward. It's just something fun. It's something stimulating. And also happiness can be a trigger. And coming from, I work with boys and men with eating disorders, and in the eating disorder community, there's always this sort of talk about, these negative triggers of anxiety and depression and stress and anger. But with ADHD folks, it could be, I'm in a great mood, so let's keep this party going and keep eating. And so it could really be any sort of emotional state. And then lastly is, for a lot of people with ADHD grow up, whether they were diagnosed when they were young or not, but it can take a hit on your self-esteem and how you feel about yourself. And food can become a way of coping with that. So when you put all of that together, to me, it makes perfect sense why we would see dysregulated eating, obesity, binge eating behaviors to be more prevalent in the ADHD population.
Is obesity influenced by behavior, economics, environment, genetics, or all of the above?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about obesity, it's very important that we understand this as not just an issue of someone who's eating too much, or not just an issue of they're not exercising enough. That's such a simplistic way that, unfortunately, culturally, we look at this issue. It really is a complex number of factors that come together. And your question really speaks to that, which is that we also have to look at this issue of obesity and understanding the resources that people have. So if we take food, for example, that we're assuming that everybody has equal access to healthy food. That's not the case. That if you are someone who has limited financial resources, you're not going to buy a $15 kale and Brussels sprout salad that might be healthier, but is a lot of money. It makes more economical sense to maybe get, let's say, something that's fast food that might be high in fat, but to some people that might be the only meal they have in that day to sort of carry them forward. So having access to healthy food, having access to information about healthy eating, in terms of, different cultural factors that play into what people are taught about food and in eating, and how important it is to pay attention to that. So economics absolutely plays a part in it, in our ability to be physically active. It's in the medical community, there's still a ways to go, because it might be easy for a doctor to say, okay, you need to lose weight, just go to the gym. Well, that's assuming you can afford a gym. That's assuming or go to a playground. Well, that's assuming you're in a neighborhood that's safe, where you even have accessibility to a playground, or that it's safe to do those things. So we're looking at this from, and then genetically, absolutely, is that the fact is we are born into this world with a set of genes. And, genetics, sometimes it becomes this conversation piece where I think people who are not always sympathetic to people who might struggle with obesity to say, oh, they just say it's all in their genes. Well, no, it's not an excuse. It's an understanding, though, that the truth is that we all have different bodies, and we are all are wired differently. So we're all not starting from the same place. And so we are, there's that nature component of our genetics, and then there's the nurture component of, now, how do we eat? What eating habits do we set aside and build into? And what access do we have to good food, to healthy food, to activity? And then also keeping in mind of just behaviorally. I mean, some people, if you're working 3 jobs, you don't have time to go to the gym. If you're, raising children, it's very hard sometimes. A lot of parents, I'm sure, can relate that, they'll feed their kids really well, but when it comes to their own self-care, can go out the window. So I always want to encourage that when we're looking even at this topic of obesity, that we're trying to hold all of these factors in mind, and understanding that not everyone is coming from the same place. And that's particularly true when we think about different cultural groups, and in communities of color and lower socioeconomic, groups, that we look at this with compassion at trying to understand how this problem is developed, rather than just blaming people for, oh, it's your fault, in that kind of way.
In general, obesity is much more common within some groups than others. Black women and Hispanic men and women all have obesity rates that are higher than the national average. Why is that? And secondly, is there data that shows the rate of obesity for these groups when ADHD is present?
So absolutely, that studies show that with non-Hispanic Black adults tend to have higher rates of obesity, followed by Hispanic adults, and then white Americans. Non-Hispanic Asian adults actually have the lowest rates of obesity, and so you definitely see these cultural differences. So it's an excellent question, because even now, when we're looking at a topic, it's not this singular thing. We have to really understand the intersectionality of this topic, that when we're talking about women, men, communities of color. So we know that part of that disparity speaks to some of those factors that I mentioned before, that in communities of color, that you may not have the same sort of accessibility, the same sort of contact, or sometimes trust in the medical community. I think a lot of times how the messages of eating healthily and increasing physical activity, unfortunately, isn't always said with compassion. It's sometimes said in this very judgmental way. And if you have a doctor that's like, yep, you just need to lose 50 pounds or else you're going to be on taking insulin, which is one of my patients told me recently, that's the doctor just said it that way. And the truth is, from the medical community, they're just looking at this very concretely. Sometimes they're looking at it as, yes, this is the numbers, and if you don't make this number, you're pre-diabetic right now, you will be diabetic and you'll have to take insulin. But I think we need to advocate sort of for more compassion in how we talk to different groups, and particularly in communities of color, where there's a historical validation why there isn't a lot of trust sometimes in medical community and medical establishments around talking about these kinds of issues, that there is a tremendous amount of judgment, of discrimination, of bias that is very present when we talk about these groups, and particularly with communities of color, because people aren't taking into consideration all of these other factors involved. That even just the idea of food and sort of access to food, and not understanding the historical context of it. I remember I talked to a physician a couple months ago, and I have a client he's Hispanic and he's overweight. He actually struggled with the binge eating disorder, and he grew up in the South, and the physician said, he just has to stop eating, all the foods, that he grew up with, and that are saturated in a lot of fats and creams and things like that. And although that might be true, but the idea of understanding that, when he grew up in a very poor family where they had to fatten up their food to just as sustenance, basically. And if you grow up with those kinds of habits, it doesn't mean you can't change them, but it's having an understanding of, oh, okay, that worked in that sense of some sustenance. And now that I have more accessibility to more healthy food, how do I get that information? What are safe physical, if you're in a neighborhood that it isn't safe to play in the local playground, what are physical activity that people can do in their home to do that? How can we, eat healthily without, feeling like we have to eat like Gwyneth Paltrow? Like her cookbook, I'll never forget when her cookbook came out, and this woman, it was brilliant. She had a blog and said that she made the recipes out of Gwyneth Paltrow's cookbook, and it cost her $300 a day to get the ingredients from Gwyneth Paltrow's cookbook. And I thought, that's hilarious. I mean, to me, and I'm not saying that Gwyneth Paltrow shouldn't put out a cookbook, but the idea that, I don't know, if I were Gwyneth Paltrow, I would have to put a disclaimer to say, just to know, like, this is something that only privileged people will basically be able to cook from. So, and at the same time, it doesn't mean that people that, in communities of color, that eating, foods that could really be detrimental to their health is an inevitability. It's finding that way of speaking to them and educating them, but not in a shameful way, not in a way that's saying, oh, you're doing it all wrong, especially as parents in communities of color who obviously care about their children, that if they're being told, oh, you're feeding, because we are seeing higher rates of obesity. We're seeing the highest rates right now that we've ever seen of obesity in children. And a lot of times, of course, that parents get blamed for that. And rather than, again, the blame, it's understanding, okay, well, let me give you some ideas of sort of inexpensive, healthy meals, easy physical activities that can be done in 10, 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be an hour lifting weights, at the gym. And also really understanding, just from a longer term perspective too, that it's not, I worked with people, and sometimes in communities of color, who almost feel it's an inevitability because so many of their family members, let's say, might be diabetic, that it's just in their genes. And genes are not, we don't want to look at our genetics as, this predetermined thing. Genetics are, they're predisposing factors, but whether they pop out or not really depends on our behaviors and our environment. So it's not, we also don't want people to feel almost fatalistic about it. Like, yep, I'm going to get it anyway, so I might as well eat, how I want to eat. So we want to encourage a good relationship with food. And I think also in communities of color too, that, certainly I see this in my family, that, food and community are very, very tied together. I mean, the idea of culture and And I love that. I mean, I grew up with, you know, parents, you know, my dad's Hispanic, my mom was Brazilian, that where food and parties and eating and like loving food. And I mean, I'll text a picture of a meal and send it to my sister, you know, and like people think that's weird. I'm like, what? It's like a beautiful like meal. Look at this. Like, I mean, there's a passion around food. And I think that's to be celebrated in communities of color, that you see sort of just the pride around food and I think that sometimes that gets mistaken as, oh, that being gluttonous in some sense. But we can still love the food and and be healthy and to have sort of boundaries around that. So to your question also about ADHD, there really aren't studies that, I mean, there are certainly a number of studies that look at ADHD and obesity. There are a number of studies that look at obesity in minority populations. I have really not seen studies that have looked at ADHD, obesity, minority populations, and sort of looking at that. And I think that that is where more research absolutely has to go.
What are some of the common comorbid conditions that result from obesity?
Yeah, so obesity really, you know, even though again, studies show that about 42% of adults are overweight or obese, it really is responsible for a number of medical problems and medical consequences that we really have to take seriously. So things, being overweight, being obese, puts you at higher risk for diabetes, for cardiovascular events, for strokes, certainly high blood pressure, cholesterol, gastrointestinal problems, sleep disorders like sleep apnea that can be associated with higher weight, and then sleep apnea plus obesity creates even a bigger, you know, issue because now you're not sleeping correctly. Many cancers have been implicated with obesity, and then psychologically, and I treat a lot of people who either even people who don't have clinical eating disorders who may be overweight but have very poor body image because of that, depression, anxiety around that. Now, some of that the problem lies within our culture, in that part of that depression and anxiety is because if people are overweight and are discriminated against or judged for that. And that's the cultural issue that we have to address. And at the same time, we all want to feel good about our bodies. We don't have to be, we don't have to look like a Calvin Klein model though to do that. So there are definitely lots of consequences that come along with that. And then that creates sort of even more, because then you have these illnesses that need to be managed, that you need medical resources for, and sometimes money to afford medications and drugs to manage them. And it just becomes this really tough cycle.
When treating an individual who has obesity and ADHD, which do you treat first, the ADHD symptoms or the obesity?
Absolutely both. That I think the problem is with ADHD is still vastly clinically underappreciated. That I find that you know, obviously at Chad, we know we're so in the know about this, but it's still striking to me how I'll talk to people in just different communities who may know that their patients, let's say, have ADHD, but they're like, oh, well, that's, what does that have to do with them being overweight? Or you know, they just see it as an academic issue, or they think, oh, they're not hyper, and I'm thinking, no, 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 this affects every life domain, and in fact, it's the everyday things of eating and sleeping and things like this that ADHD impacts. So one of the things that I feel so passionately about in talking about this issue of ADHD, and I give talks in communities, you know, eating disorder communities. I talk to physicians who work with obese patients, sleep disorder patients, to say, please, please recognize, well, first identify the ADHD if it's there, recognize it, and you have to treat it, because untreated ADHD will undermine the treatment of any comorbid issue. And studies have shown that, you know, that if you have ADHD that's not being treated, you're going to be less compliant and when I say less compliant, not in a oppositional way, but your executive functioning is just poor to take medications, to use a CPAP, to treat your sleep apnea, to remember to go to the doctor appointment. All of these things, the executive functioning issues, they have to be worked on. And so when I have somebody who has ADHD and they're looking to have healthy weight loss or to manage an eating disorder, we're absolutely, I would say, even first, really looking at the ADHD component. How managed and treated is it? And once that is managed and treated, you see such an elevation in energy. Absolutely both. That I think the problem is with ADHD is still vastly clinically underappreciated. That I find that obviously at Chad, we know we're so in the know about this, but it's still striking to me how I'll talk to people in just different communities who may know that their patients, let's say, have ADHD, but they're like, oh, well, what does that have to do with them being overweight? Or they just see it as an academic issue, or they think, oh, they're not hyper, and I'm thinking, no, 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 this affects every life domain, and in fact, it's the everyday things of eating and sleeping and things like this that ADHD impacts. So one of the things that I feel so passionately about in talking about this issue of ADHD, and I give talks in communities, eating disorder communities. I talk to physicians who work with obese patients, sleep disorder patients, to say, please, please recognize, well, first identify the ADHD if it's there, recognize it, and you have to treat it, because untreated ADHD will undermine the treatment of any comorbid issue. And studies have shown that, that if you have ADHD that's not being treated, you're going to be less compliant, and when I say less compliant, not in a oppositional way, but your executive functioning is just poor to take medications, to use a CPAP, to treat your sleep apnea, to remember to go to the doctor appointment. All of these things, the executive functioning issues, they have to be worked on. And so when I have somebody who has ADHD and they're looking to have healthy weight loss or to manage an eating disorder, we're absolutely, I would say, even first, really looking at the ADHD component. How managed and treated is it? And once that is managed and treated, you see such an elevation in energy at being able to now treat the other issue. But I really, my heart goes out to a lot of these individuals that I work with, because if they didn't know that they had ADHD, if it wasn't diagnosed, and in communities of color, we still see, it's sometimes overdiagnosed, sometimes underdiagnosed, and it's still not fine-tuned, particularly in ethnic minorities, that if you don't even understand that that's even in the picture, then it's very easy to start thinking, yeah, maybe it's my fault. Maybe I deserve this negative feedback and this stigma and this discrimination. And then and if you deal with that by using food as a substance to soothe, it just really kind of works on itself. So the ADHD absolutely, absolutely is going to be, I would say, probably looked at first, because I want to know how much traction we can get from really managing and treating the ADHD. And then let's delve into the obesity, let's delve into the eating issues.
Let's talk about the management and treatment of obesity with ADHD in the African American community. Are there barriers in the community that may prevent an individual from getting help?
Absolutely. There are a lot of barriers. And I think at first is we want and need to understand that the work is really on our part in the medical community, the psychiatric community, of how to outreach to these communities, and really outreach again with compassion and with an understanding that that obesity is a multidimensional issue with a lot of different factors, and really speaking to that community. That it's almost like, if you think about ADHD in general, that how many of us with ADHD have heard, oh, well, just get a planner or just do this or just do that. That worked for all the neurotypical people. And we know with ADHD doesn't always work that way. That once I certainly in my life, if I heard that kind of advice that, from a teacher or whatever, that I just knew intuitively did not speak to me, it would just be discredited. Like I just discredit that source in a sense. And we have to understand that communities of color have been doing, that's been historical. Where they're hearing voices that aren't really attuned to where they're at and meeting them where they're at. So that's the job that the medical community, the psychiatric community, of having to understand where these people are coming from and how to really attune to them and attune to their needs so that there is now trust. Because it's not that African Americans are distrustful and suspicious in that way, that there is a valid foundation for that. And so when we can honor that and understand that, to then basically create more trust around that, and then giving very concrete sort of information of here are foods that are health, just psychoeducation about nutrition basically, and ways that isn't going to break the bank like the Gwyneth Paltrow cookbook, and user-friendly ways of engaging in physical activity, celebrating small wins. I don't like to use the word baby steps. I don't like that term, but for lack of a better term, because people know what that means, that to really honor those what seemingly are small steps, but I see any step as a big step, because it means that big step, the next one could be an exponentially bigger one and a bigger one. And we know with ADHD treatment, that's the case, that it's a game changer when people are treated for their ADHD as to then how they approach other issues that they're working on. I think the same is going to be true when we sort of look at talking about obesity in communities of color. And so giving a lot of information in ways, and helping them understand too that it's the health implications of it in a way that, again, is always coming from a more compassionate view. Having support groups too, I think, for parents to have places to talk to other parents about this, around whether it's everything from exchanging recipe ideas, to what can people do to just think about food and develop a relationship to food in a different kind of way.
What would you say to teenagers that are struggling?
Absolutely. I think first and foremost is when I work with younger people who are overweight or obese, is all of the factors that I ran by you earlier around, this is why having ADHD can make it easier for this to happen, is one, to just educate people, to have them know, okay, this isn't an issue of willpower, which is another term I don't like, that this isn't, it's very easy. It's simple. And this is true when I talk about addiction, which, people with ADHD, we carry a higher risk of any kind of addictive behavior. It's very easy if you don't have that genetic factor of having an addictive personality. It's so easy to just say, just stop eating, stop drinking, stop smoking, stop. And for someone like myself who has a very addictive personality, it's like, well, clearly you're not wired the same way that I am. If it's just not that easy for people. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't say, well, those are your genes, so go be addicted to whatever. But it's starting with, let's understand why this is more difficult, because what we don't want to happen is the spiral of, oh, I'm weak, I have no willpower, and so I'm going to now use food as more of a solace and more of a comfort, and now it's only exacerbating the issue. So we start with the education, and then concrete tips and tools of encouraging really mindful behavior. So when I'm working with really anybody who is overweight or obese, I wouldn't say that my work is about weight loss. That's not sort of how I look at it from my role. It's really around encouraging habits that are likely going to result in healthy weight loss. So we would start with mindful eating. Are you aware of what you're eating? Are you aware of how much you're eating? If you go to a restaurant, do you know how much fat and calories? I tell people, I remember there was a sandwich at the Cheesecake Factory that I saw a TV show with Chris Rock. It was a TV show of celebrities' favorite sandwiches. And Chris Rock said, "Oh, the grilled shrimp and bacon club at Cheesecake Factory is my favorite." And I thought, "Ooh, that sounds good." When, the next time I was at Cheesecake Factory, I had it. It was really delicious. And then Cheesecake Factory never published their nutritional information on their website for a reason. And then I guess it got leaked or something was online. And I saw the grams of fat in the sandwich. I was apoplectic. I could not believe that they could physically even manufacture that much fat into a sandwich. And I thought, oh my gosh, like that's like artery clogging. And granted, it doesn't mean I'll never eat it. I mean, I actually haven't had it since, but because I just didn't find it worth it. But it's not that I wouldn't eat something that even if I find out, however, I might have half of the sandwich or I might eat it a lot less frequently. And the power of that knowledge, most Americans actually are not aware of the nutritional content of their food. And so when we just look it up online, we have that accessibility now that we didn't have pre-internet. But being mindful, how fast do you eat? We know people with ADHD tend to eat faster than people without ADHD. I was definitely a Hoover, when I was a kid. And it wasn't until I was in college that people were like, "Man, you eat fast." And I'm like, really? Like, because I don't know. I wasn't even aware of it. So once I became aware of it, I can think, oh, okay, let me eat slower, put my fork down in between bites. And then you end up eating less because your stomach is communicating with your brain by saying, "I'm good, I'm satisfied, I don't need to eat anymore." So it's helping that teen basically develop habits and not have it be about the number on the scale, because then that can create a whole other problem. That obesity is not considered a clinical eating disorder because, again, it's multidimensional. However, obesity can lead to eating disorders in the sense that people can start in the attempt of healthy weight loss, get obsessive about it. "Oh my gosh, I only lost a pound this week." And then they start to starve themselves and then they binge eat. And it can create this really dysregulated issue with food, which people with ADHD, there is a higher prevalence of bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder in ADHD populations. Less and not so much anorexia nervosa, although I have treated people with ADHD and anorexia, but bulimia and binge eating are more common. So concrete things that start to make them more mindful of their eating, that have them think, is this worth it? Like soda. Like I don't drink any soda. I only drink soda water and black coffee. That's the only thing I drink. And now I'm not saying everybody has to cut out soda, but for me, I got when I have like a good seltzer water that's flavored, that kind of hits the spot in the same way that soda, did for me. It took a little while though to do it. But, when I was a kid, I would be, even though it wasn't allowed in my house, which thanks, to my parents at the time, I wasn't happy with it. But now I'm like, that was a very good decision. But it wouldn't stop me from going to my best friend's house and chugging Mountain Dew like it was going out of style. But I wouldn't feel good afterwards. And that's the other piece to food is, how do you feel after? Do we reflect? And people with ADHD often don't really think and sit with, "Oh, my stomach feels a little not so good," or they might be having GI issues or gas or acid reflux, and not connected to, "Oh, wait a minute, I did eat a lot, or I ate the kinds of foods that I was eating probably." So that's what I always want to encourage in doing this kind of work, especially for teens, and helping them also just look at the other parts of their self-esteem. That body image is certainly, we don't want it to be the dominant part of anybody's self-esteem because that'll get anyone into trouble. However, our body image is part of our self-esteem for a lot of people. We want to feel good about our bodies. We want to feel attractive, especially when you're a teenager and you're hitting puberty. But it doesn't mean you have to be, for women, this size 0, and for men, looking like you're on the cover of Men's Fitness magazine to feel good about your body.
That is so true. Well, before we end, is there anything you would like to add that I haven't asked?
I'm grateful that you're all, that you're doing this podcast, because I think part of how we start to change the messaging out there is just getting the visibility and the message out there, and not only just with this combination of ADHD and obesity, but looking at it from an intersectional lens of African American individuals, looking at, men and women, looking at, even when we look further divided, of African American women and obesity and ADHD, or African American men, and I mean, just all of that, and also too, body image. In one of the things that in the African American community, that a lot of times a larger body is actually more celebrated. So in some ways, one of the what's seen as almost a positive is that in the African American community, you don't see an idealization of, let's say, a size 0 woman in the way that you would see in Caucasian populations. So that's a plus in that way, that there's definitely more acceptance of larger bodies and in ways that could be seen as appealing and attractive. And we want it to also just be healthy as well. And to know that you can be in a larger body and still be very healthy. And there are people certainly that I treat who have eating disorders who are in quote unquote normal weight ranges, who are very unhealthy because of what they're doing to their bodies to get to that place. So again, we always want to look at this through a lens of health at the end of the day, and habits that we're instilling. And we know with ADHD, that can be a little bit more of a challenge, but it's certainly not impossible.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh, my pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the All Things ADHD podcast from CHADD's National Resource Center on ADHD.